Life, death, rebirth. What is the nature of the world that we live in? What is it that separates humans from demons or even a god? If you could recreate the world in your own image, would you be able to? Should you be able to, despite being just a human being? Or is it because that you are human that you're the only one who could reshape the world? How could one begin to even comprehend such questions?
Yo, shut up, nerd!
Hey everyone, welcome back to Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei game, a series that I started to make myself go through my Atlas backlog and also convince all of you to play a real Shin Megami Tensei game. Funnily enough, some may argue that this is the first time I've actually played a real Shin Megami Tensei game, however, around here, we play things fast and loose, so if I want to play and make a video on it, I'm gonna do it. Basically, as long as the game has a snowman who calls me a hoe, we're counting it. So this time round, we'll be looking at Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne. Specifically, its remaster that I planned on doing a little bit closer to its own release, but well, that certainly didn't happen. I had several projects crop up all at once, and sadly I chose sleep over having the eyes of a Kaneko character design. Blasphemous, I know, but here we are. SMT3 starts with a woman in an ethereal locale asking for our name. Knowing what I already did about Nocturne, I was going in with some very clear goals in mind, so I appropriately named myself Kuroshima Kamisama, which badly translates to kill the great god. After experiencing this weird vision, Kuroshi and his pals are all looking for their teacher as she called for them to meet her at a hospital for some unknown reason. Kuroshi, having an awful sense of direction, instead ends up at the park, where he bumps into occultism magazine writer Orlando Bloom, who reveals to him that there was some sort of riot between two cults at the park the night before, and while investigating the matter, he's found a trail of clues that lead him to the same hospital that we're going to. However, it's probably fine, just don't think about it too much. It's at the hospital that we run into our friends, Isamu, who is rocking a very stylish combination with his hat, jacket and vest all complementing each other, finishing off the outfit with some ripped jeans and a demon belt buckle just to give the whole ensemble a little bit of edge. And Chiaki, whose bold and brash combination of jutes, a jop, a jert dress, and her crop top jacket? Yes, this is two separate bits of clothing, which is all finally tied together with her jutility gelt. A fashion choice that is as brave as it is an insult on the senses. Kuroshi and Isamu split up to look for their teacher, while Chiaki steals your shit and sits on her ass as she pretends to help. It's at this point while exploring we run into some really weird stuff, as well as encountering a black strawberry man staring ominously at a spinning oil drum, mumbling about how he just wants a quiet life and would kill anyone who would disturb it. Fortunately, our teacher steps in and makes him stand down before any hands can be taken.
I'll be waiting on the roof. We'll have a good view of the city from there.
Whoa, lady, I don't think I should be having any romantic dates with my teacher. You know this isn't Persona, right? It turns out, however, that we're not the only ones getting screwed when we get up there, since the reason why we're going to the roof is actually to see the end of the world take place. Congrats, by the way, less than 30 minutes in and everybody's already dead. Things are going swell. What we just witnessed is known as the Conception, an event in which the world folds in on itself and collapses, creating what is known as the Vortex World, which is essentially a demon-filled cocoon preparing for the world to be reborn anew. After blacking out, a mysterious young boy and woman present themselves, and shove something that I don't think is our usual Flintstones multivitamin down our throats. Man, these edibles ain't shit. Wait, what the
Behold my demons!
So yeah, what we ate was actually known as a Magatama. Not a real one, but rather a sort of demonic parasite that resembles one. And this little MacGuffin is what's turned Kuroshi into a demon with the heart of a human, a demi-fiend, if you will. It's from here that the demi-fiend has to find out what's going on in this new Tokyo, where angels and demons reside, what he's going to do about it, and ultimately, who is he going to choose to help create this new world. It is from this point where Nocturne gets into its main gameplay loop for pretty much now until the end of the game. SMT3 is actually quite odd with how it plays, despite the fact that it's a fairly basic JRPG and very core SMT. For starters, while I wouldn't classify Nocturne as a dungeon crawler, it still definitely feels very similar to one. The story, while interesting, is very slow paced, but not because it has long cutscenes with tons of exposition. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Bits of story and little character interactions that exist in Nocturne are kind of breadcrumbed as you trudge your way through a desolate landscape. However, there's not really much downtime either, as you're on the story path whether you like it or not. There's not really too many side quests, and the ones that do exist, at least in the early game, are for the most part just little detours that result in a optional mini-boss. On top of this, there are virtually no safe spaces in the game, with even the closest things resembling towns in SMT3 having demons that will jump you. This results in an RPG that is very oppressive and has this constant pressure being put on you, which can feel a little intimidating at times or even exhausting in some situations. But honestly, I think this really adds something to the atmosphere. This world is cruel and unrelenting and clearly no place for a human to survive, and Nocturne wants you to feel that intently. As far as the battle system and RPG mechanics go, Nocturne is very likely going to feel familiar to you if you've played any other modern SMT game. Being the first major SMT game of the 6th generation, go away SMT9, Nocturne was a sort of reboot for the franchise. Not necessarily story-wise, since the series didn't really have much in terms of direct sequels anyway, but more in terms of gameplay-wise. For example, demons could actually level up now. The demon summoning currency, Magnetite, was removed, and aspects of demon negotiation and summoning were tweaked as well. However, what is probably the biggest change lies in the game's combat. Nocturne saw the birth of the press turn system, which has been represented in pretty much every single modern SMT game since, be it in its default state like Digital Devil Saga or SMT4, or evolved into something else like Persona's Once More system or the follow-up attacks in Strange Journey and Tokyo Mirage Sessions. The press turn system, for the uninformed, is a gameplay system designed around rewarding the player for exploiting enemy weaknesses and landing critical hits. Each turn you are given several press turns equal to the number of characters you have in your active party, in Nocturne's case that being a maximum of 4. This means that under normal circumstances each party member can act once per turn. However, if you hit an enemy with a skill that is weak to, land a critical hit with a physical move, or simply choose to not act and pass your turn, only half of a press turn will be used, signified by one of the icons in the top right glowing. This essentially allows for each party member to be able to act twice or potentially even 3 times per turn in specific situations. On the flip side of this, however, if an attack is dodged, nullified, absorbed, or repelled, then multiple press turns will be used up instead. This creates an interesting risk and reward system in the gameplay, as certain situations may arise where you could heal now, or you could attack first, landing a crit or exploiting a weakness, and then heal on your extra turns that you've created, thus doubling your efficiency, but also at the same time running the risk of potentially missing with those attacks and losing your opportunity to heal altogether. What really makes the press turn system so interesting, however, is that the enemy plays by the same rule set as you do, meaning they can also make use of press turns, and on top of that, bosses all have 2 press turns to their name by default, and enemy parties can have higher than just 4 demons. This is part of the reason why Nocturne has this stigma for being hard, which is something I'd honestly have to argue against. Nocturne isn't necessarily hard, but sometimes when it feels like it can be bullshit. However, boss fights themselves, unlike random encounters, are known entities. I'm sure many of you know about the infamous Matador fight, and if you go unprepared, he will tear you apart. However, after being ruined, you'll learn 2 valuable lessons. The first, which is specific to him, is that he has wind magic. Force magic? Why do both Garu and Zan exist? Like, they're the same thing. Anyway, with that knowledge in mind, you can now either fuse a demon that nullifies or absorbs force magic, or you can grab a new handy dandy Magatama from the shop just before this boss fight that makes Demi-Fiend immune to force magic instead. Not only does this give you a party member or two which will not be damaged by half of his moveset, but as a result, will also make Matador burn for a bunch of his turns much faster thanks to the press turn system. The other lesson that you'll learn is when experiencing Matador's Red Capote ability, which does 4 hit and evasion buffs at the start of the fight. After experiencing what it's like to fight someone with 4 evasion buffs stacked on top of each other, you soon realise that while you can't prepare demons for what might be coming ahead if you don't know what's coming, you can certainly still use evasion buffs to take advantage of the press turn system on enemy turns. And this doesn't only apply to the evasion buff, but to the others as well. I feel like stat increasing moves in a lot of RPGs, looking at UPVE Pokemon, are usually pretty useless, and it's conditioned a lot of people to avoid using anything that doesn't deal damage. However, the Shin Megami Tensei series has a huge focus on buffing in longer fights, and 3 is no exception. Not only is buffing attack and defense useful for the most obvious reasons, but as I just explained, the dodge and hit rate buffs are really useful for exploiting the press turn system. After all, who really needs defense when the enemy burns through all 4 of its press turns with a multi-target attack that misses 2 of your party members? The press turn system may give the enemy the ability to kill you just as much as you have the ability to kill them, but it also means that you as the player know your enemy's Achilles heel more than anyone else, since you've had to deal with the same problems before and now you can use those problems against them. So yeah, as long as you engage in the game's unique systems, it won't be as notoriously hard as a lot of people make it out to be. Granted, as I mentioned, it can still be bullshit whenever it feels like it. And what do I mean by that? Well, picture this. You're playing Nocturne, you're having a good time, you prepare for the Matador fight, and you're on your first real attempt to take him down, and you do it with relative ease, and you think, heh, I'm pretty good at this game. I sure hope I can keep this up.
Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne would never take advantage of our innate gullibility.
That's good news. Thank you, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne.
That's just about everything in terms of the combat, but being an RPG means that half the battle lies in the menus. Something that I mentioned briefly but not talked much about in terms of what it brings to the gameplay side of things is the Magatama, which are the key to kitting out your Demi-Fiend with new skills as well as improving their stats. Magatama kinda act like a mixture between equipment with weapon skills that you can learn and a job system. Each one will affect your stats in some sort of way, as well as imbuing you with different weaknesses and resistances. They also have several skills that they can teach you when leveling up past certain thresholds, which will allow you to progressively evolve your main character as you go throughout the game. It's a very open system and can even let you shift your entire character build halfway through the game. This is due to your stat caps being a relatively low number of 40, at least for an RPG, and with the use of stat bonuses from late game Magatamas, you honestly don't really need to get too much past 30 for each of those stats, meaning that you can choose how you want to use your level ups with not much worry. Something else that helps the Magatama system stand out and be a bit more unique among other SMT games is the fact that it gives Demi-Fiend several unique skills that are exclusive to just him. All of these are quite powerful, at least for the point in the game that you pick them up, and it really helps set him apart from every other demon that you can recruit and give him just a little bit of extra visual flair. And speaking of visual flair, let's not so subtly segue into the game's visuals and overall presentation. While Nocturne is getting close to being 20 years old at this point, and while the remaster really doesn't do an awful lot to sort of help that, I do think from a visual standpoint, SMT3 does still hold up really well. Mainly due to a mixture of Kaneko's artwork having its own very distinct style which really stands out, and the original team recreating it incredibly well with its 3D models. It's not to the same level as Mega Man Legends or Okami, but I do feel the game has this somewhat timeless look to it. If you were to place a 3D model of any of the characters side by side with their character art, they'd look nearly identical. Granted, if they were done these days, I'm sure they'd probably look a lot better with a higher polygon count and such, and sometimes it could certainly stand to have better animation, especially considering we know what Atlas can do with like the likes of SMT5 and everything they've done with Catherine. But at the end of the day, these characters are still incredible recreations of their art, and I think they've really stood the test of time because of that. The environments, on the other hand, are a little bit of a different story. Some areas look genuinely fantastic, like the Amala corridor, and while its simplistic look feels more like an intended choice rather than a limitation, certain aspects of it have not aged well, an example being anything far off in the distance while being in a wide open outside area. Stuff like a very low resolution skybox that's very clearly not meant to be seen in HD, as well as a few other things, really just make the game feel a little bit muddy in places. Something else that kind of bugged me was that while the final dungeon has a really cool aesthetic, at the same time, the entire place is just made up of identical looking cubes. They do use them in a really cool way, but it does also kind of feel somewhat basic and cheap. In fact, that's something I feel applies to most of the dungeon designs in SMT3. It's that nearly every dungeon feels like it's trial and error. At the beginning of the game, I actually liked this quite a bit. The one dungeon with the spinning blocks that lets you open new pathways between them is pretty neat, and with its unique camera angle, while it's a bit of a guessing game still, you can see the whole floor at once, meaning you can observe what changes are made when you pull the switches, and act accordingly. But these sorts of dungeons keep cropping up over and over, and while some of them are handled better than others, I found that every time one cropped up, I resented it more than the last. Even in situations where I managed to guess the first time round, my OCD would scream at me that I might have missed a chest with a useful item. Alas, I refuse to let myself care for my own sanity. I hope to never see a teleport maze ever again. Though I think that both the best and the worst of what Nocturne has to offer in its dungeons is perfectly accumulated in the Labyrinth of Amala, the game's optional side dungeon that locks away the true demon ending, and where Dante and Rido spend half of their screen time hanging out. When it's being good, the Labyrinth of Amala is filled with all sorts of cool rewards and lore as you progress deeper, as well as some genuinely fun gameplay gimmicks. But unfortunately, every neat addition in the Labyrinth is sandwiched between some pretty tedious BS. Putting the dungeon's very corridor-based design and high encounter rate aside, the stuff that makes the Labyrinth of Amala a pain to deal with is also the stuff that could be improved so easily. The Labyrinth of Amala has 5 levels, or kalpas, that you unlock by fighting the fiend bosses throughout the story. Naturally, you'd want to visit each kalpa the moment you get access to it, and each kalpa is balanced relatively well for your level when gaining access to them. Maybe a little bit too tough to jump in right away, but it is optional content, so it makes sense for it to just push you a little bit more. The problem lies in the fact that the game makes you waste so much of your time if you go there as soon as you can. To access each kalpa, a minigame must be played where you dive into the void and avoid and punch MacGuffins. This would be perfectly fine, however, you need to do them coming back up as well. And the fast way to the top is always at the beginning of each kalpa, just past a locked door. So, for example, if you finish the second kalpa, unless you have access to the third, you have to go all the way back through the dungeon that you just explored, instead of just fast traveling back to the top. You could just wait until you defeated more of the fiends, but then earlier kalpas are boring to explore since you can just auto-battle your way through them, and it just feels like a few tweaks here and there would have made this entire dungeon a lot less frustrating and a lot more fun to actually play. Now, I've only really talked about the story and characters in the opening summary, but I do want to talk about them in a little bit more detail here. Nocturne likes to pretend it's got this deep, thought-provoking story on the surface, but once you get past that first layer, you realise that it's actually just about punching things in the face. Giant stingray giving you trouble? This is for Steve Irwin, you douchebag! Succubus asking what that dick do? Pee bitch, leave me alone.
Nice.
Elephant man in your way? You better not forget this, asshole! In all seriousness though, the story does have some stuff going on. For starters, pretty much every single human being in this game is an asshole. The world's going to be reborn anew, however, it can only be done by a human with a strong enough view on how they want the new world to be constructed. This is something that's referred to as a reason. Mechanically, they're not dissimilar to the law and chaos alignments in every other SMT game. But because of this, every human character has a shift in personality when they realise they have the potential to create the world as they see fit, not unlike a god. The changes that they go through are really not that surprising, since they basically slept through the apocalypse, and everything they knew is now dead and gone. The problem I have with it is that due to the interaction between you and the other human characters being relatively low, you don't really get to see this change happen. It's just something that occurs over 2, maybe 3 if you're lucky cutscenes, and at the end of the day, it really doesn't change the fact that they're all assholes. Since Demi-Fiend is now part demon, he can't create a reason of his own, so he only gets to pick which one he wants to support. And this is unfortunate, since 1, they all exploit him at best or cause him a ton of problems at worst, and 2, the reasons all suck. While all 3 of the main endings leave it up to interpretation, from the sounds of it, the world that would be created from them would be a genuinely miserable existence. Though, if anything, that kind of feels like it's intended, as it gives you an incentive to look for the other endings, as just about anything would be better than the options that are directly given to you. Regardless, it does mean that during my playthrough, all of my best friends were demons, and this one mudman who looks like he's about to drop a fire mixtape. Despite for my general dislikes for the characters themselves, I do feel like they serve a good purpose for the game's theming and such. And while I think I prefer the typical lore and chaos alignment system, that's probably due to just having less exposure to it, since there's definitely only so much ground that can be covered with it, so the reasons do allow for some fresh new viewpoints to show up. Before I start wrapping things up, I do want to talk about the remaster itself. It's kinda meh. It's an incredibly basic port, and it's missing some really obvious improvements that really should have been there, especially for the original asking price. The new improvements to stuff like the lighting and the UI is stuff that I liked personally, but I'd fully understand why it's a mixed bag for some people. However, things like voice acting and the new quality of life improvements, such as actual skill transfer, is great and a much needed addition, especially for fresh blood that are coming back to the older games. Persona 3 was my first SMT game, and I never want to willingly go back to opening and closing the fusion menu 50 times just to get the skill that I want. And while the voice acting isn't fully implemented, I do think it's nice just to have a voice to put to each character. The other plus side of the remaster is getting content that we never had before, like Raido, and the Japanese-only vanilla version of Nocturne being available on PC. By the way, the PC port is kinda shit. For starters, the resolution setting is a lie. It's just the display setting. The game runs at 1080p even if you select 1440p or 4K. You can get it running higher if you modify the hex code, but I really don't think that downloading a separate bit of software and essentially modding my game is really something that should be in a PC port. On top of that, when I tried to do that, it kind of ran a little bit crappy for me, so I kind of just gave up. Another thing is that the anti-aliasing, as far as I can tell, just doesn't work, so Demi-Fiend's tattoos have this like really jagged look to them. This is something that applies to the PS4 and Switch versions as well, though on PC you are able to use your graphic card settings to force anti-aliasing. It will make the game look a little bit soft and blurry, but in the process will get rid of all of those jagged edges, or at least heavily reduce them. Speaking of mods though, I think there is one that is essential if you have the means to do it. And that is the HD Audio for HD Ears mod for both PC and hacked switches. One of the biggest problems with the remaster is the fact that it still uses the horribly compressed audio from the PS2 version of the game. The reason probably being is that while high quality versions of the tracks from Nocturne's OST exist, there are actually multiple variants of a bunch of the tracks based on the moon's phases, and we only have high quality versions of one of a lot of these tracks. While I think the rest have all been lost to the age-old Japanese game dev tradition from the 90s and early 2000s that was to burn all of the source files after the game's release. Luckily, however, there is one hero who took it upon themselves to still try and add the uncompressed music. I played the game with the 0.1 version of the mod, which just uses all of the songs from the uncompressed OST album. However, since beating the game, a 0.6 version has been released. I'm not 100% sure what exactly the 0.6 version adds. However, I did speak to the creator of the mod when the remaster first released, and their plan was to recreate the missing tracks by taking what they could from the compressed variations and mixing them from scratch using the higher quality versions as a base. It all seemed like very impressive stuff to me and was well over my head, but also seemed really cool, and I certainly appreciated the benefits of the 0.1 version. You can find the creator of the mod on Twitter at GayFortnite. You can find the creator of the mod, Bladercut, on Reddit. Now that I've played Nocturne, I've come to realise that it's basically the most raw SMT experience you can get. It has several refined elements from the previous games, and also established new mechanics that would become a staple for the series one way or another. At the same time, however, I feel like these strengths are also the game's weaknesses. While I think it's cool that it establishes its identity as an SMT game, it also strips away a lot of traditional JRPG things like equipment and a heavy emphasis on character interactions that I miss quite a bit. On top of all of that, I feel like future SMT games kinda use Nocturne as a base and then add on top of them, which in general makes them a little bit more interesting to me. It's very easy to see why Nocturne is so highly regarded by so many people. I'd probably describe it as the perfectly cooked steak of the Shin Megami Tensei series. Incredibly well prepared and served, but at the same time lacks the same seasoning, spice or sauce that the other items on the menu can provide. Also, if you were getting it at launch, kind of expensive for what you're getting. Regardless, I did enjoy my time punching demons in the face and rejecting God in Shin Megami Tensei Lucifer's Call. Wait, what? Featuring Dante from the Devil May Cry series! Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. It took way too long to get this out, and hopefully I won't let myself get too distracted with side projects again. Spoiler, I probably will. On the plus side, I do have a few videos that I've already started work on in some shape or form, and hopefully they'll come out sooner rather than later. One being the port report on the Nayuta no Kiseki remaster for PS4, so keep an eye out for that. As for the next episode in the Parsmg series, I'll probably be doing Raido Kuzunoa versus the Soulless Army. Figured that'd be a good one to do next, since 1, the guy's really heckin' cool, and 2, I've played both games that he's made a cameo in, and not either of the ones he's actually the protagonist of, so yeah, definitely wanted to give those a try. Expect to see that, hopefully, before Shin Megami Tensei 5 drops, so then I can cover that on its release as well. Anyway, toodles.